been a faithful king, that he had done what David had done. He had walked in the steps of his great up the line grandfather, and he asked God, in effect, to extend his life. Isaiah was walking across out of the palace, and he's in probably the middle court before he got out to the street level. And another message came from God: turn around, go back, and tell Hezekiah that I'm going to extend his life by 15 years. And that on the third day he will go up to my house to worship me. And so Isaiah told his attendants to put a lump of figs on, evidently had a sore bull or something, put a lump of figs on that, and he was healed and lived for 15 more years. It doubled the length of his reign. He was somewhere between 14 and 15 years into a 29-year reign at this point. So God allows him to live and serve, rule for another 15 years. And what's interesting about this is that at the time when this promise was made, Hezekiah did not have a son. Manasseh is born 3 years after this. And Manasseh will become king when he is 12 years old. And he will take his father's place. Now Hezekiah was the son of a king. Ahaz, his wife his mother's Abijah. He was the father of Manasseh, a king. So he was of the lineage of David, the dynasty or the house of David. And he is one of the few good kings that you read about in either Judah or Israel. Israel never had even one good king, and Judah didn't have a lot, but Hezekiah was one of them. Now, what we're going to do in this class is study about prayer based on Hezekiah's example. And there are 4 things that we'll emphasize this class. I'll tell you where we're going so you can see when we go, how we get there. And if you're wanting to make notes, I'll try to summarize it at the end too to make sure you got the 4 ideas. So whenever a preacher gives you his points, those are the things that he thinks are the most important things to get out of the lesson. So if you don't remember anything else, remember his points. Roman number 1, 2, 3, in this case 4. And if you're not a note taker, you're not that kind of learner, I see some notepads out, Bibles out. I'll try to take time for you to get the points if you're that kind of a learner. If you're an audio learner, then don't get confused in the details. Just try to pick out 3 things that you want to remember, whether they're the same 3 things that I make or 4 things that I make our points, or just something else you say, I need that, or I want that, or that's something interesting to me. So don't sit in a Bible class ever and not get anything out of it. Always get something out of it, whoever the teacher is. All right, let's go into this and talk about prayer. This is one of the 650 prayers in the Bible. It is also one of the 450 prayers that have an answer in the Bible, recorded in the Bible. Prayer is one of the great Bible subjects. The word prayer in various forms, pray, prayed, praying, prayer, prayeth, is used 569 times in the Bible. In the New Testament, 163 times. There are only 260 chapters, so that's about every opening of the Bible. When you're flipping through the New Testament, you have prayer on average on one page or the other. Jesus is recorded as having prayed on 22 occasions, but there are 62 references to Jesus praying when you look at the parallel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Prayer is mentioned in the book of Acts 34 times. There are only 28 chapters, so more than once per chapter. And Paul mentioned prayer 41 times. So it's a subject that is throughout the whole of the Bible. The first mention of prayer is Genesis 4:26, and it's mentioned all the way into the book of Revelation, of course. The first public worship prayer is Genesis 5:21 to 24, and that's 235 years after creation. That doesn't mean they didn't pray for the first 2 centuries. It just means there we have our first reference to public worship and prayer being a part of worship all the way from the earliest days of patriarchy through the Mosaic dispensation and, of course, in the Christian dispensation. The word prayer in the New Testament begins with the prefix EU, which means good, like a eulogy is to say something good about the deceased. So prayer has that prefix of good, and the second part of the compound is XEW. I don't know how to pronounce that, but what it means is to pour out. So literally the word prayer means to pour out good. So we pour out, there are three verbs of prayer. There's pray, which is what we're talking about. That word can mean to have a conversation with. There is praise, which is to pour out good words about God and praise. And then there's pleading. So pray, praise, and plead are the three verbs. And plead means I'm asking for what? Good things I need or desire of God. That word pour out is seen in the Old Testament. Maybe the best definition of prayer in the Bible is 1 Samuel 1:10, where it says that Hannah poured out her heart to the Lord when she wanted a child so badly, and then God honored her with Samuel. It's also seen in the New Testament in Romans 10:1, where Paul said, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is. Heart's desire and prayer tied together there, the pouring out of the feelings of the heart. Now, all that's introduction. Let's take that foundation and move into the specific study of Hezekiah's prayer. And let's read that together in 2 Kings. I went over it just in story form, but let's read it together in 2 Kings 20. You see verse 1 is where the message comes to him. And then in verse 2 in chapter 20, he turns his face to the wall and he begins to pray. And then his prayer is in verse 3. I beseech thee, beseech means to beg. I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth. He's saying to God, in effect, I have done what you said, so you do what you said. In other words, in the Old Testament especially, not in the New Testament so much, as the Old Testament, a shortened life was a sign that God disapproved of your life. And an extended life was a sign that God approved of it. For instance, in the Proverbs, when it talks about wisdom hath long life in one of her hands. So if you live a wise life, that didn't mean that everybody who died prematurely was displeasing to God, but generally speaking, and that's what Hezekiah is banking on here. He's saying, I've been living right. And as a king, I've done what I was supposed to do, unlike all the kings or most of the kings before me. I've been like David. Now, if you know the story of Hezekiah, you know he came to the throne during a time of national disgrace. People had turned to idolatry, and he rid the land of idols. He reformed the worship of God during his generation. He restored national prestige. He rebelled against the Assyrians. He had a lot of projects that he worked on. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem, even today, some of you may have been here, they'll show you Hezekiah's tunnel to this day, where he excavated and made the water source inside the wall instead of outside, so that when they were besieged, they had plenty of water. And he did other kind of building projects like that. So he was a man who had accomplished a lot and had been faithful to God. And now that he's received this message, he's going to die. He says, God, remember me. Remember what I did, how I honored your will by obedience. How I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. All right, here are the four ideas that we'll emphasize based on this interchange between God in heaven and Hezekiah on his sickbed, his deathbed. And here's a map of where we're going. Number one, Hezekiah prayed to the living God about death. Number 2, Hezekiah prayed to the compassionate God with passion. Number 3, Hezekiah prayed to the omnipotent God about his needs. And number 4, Hezekiah prayed to the gracious God with thanksgiving. Now, all these ideas come out of this text. This is what would be called a textual sermon. As we go through it, it's an adaptation of the ideas that are in this text. So let's talk about first, Hezekiah prayed to the living God about death. Do you remember when Peter made his confession of Jesus as the Son of God, Matthew 16 through 18, who do ye say that I, the Son of Man, am? And Peter spoke up and he said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now that's a thought that runs through both Old Testament and New Testament, and it's used in exchange or in contrast to the dead gods or the inanimate gods of idolatry. You know, whenever in 1 Kings 18, for instance, when Elijah took on the 450 prophets of Baal, he mocked them. He said, maybe your God's asleep, wake him up. Maybe your God's on a trip and he's out of town, he's not going to be able to help you today. You know, he mocked them because they were praying to a God who wasn't really there, a dead God, a God that they had to carve out of a piece of wood, and they used part of the wood to make a fire, and they bowed down and worshiped the part of the wood that they carved into some shape. The prophets made fun of that. They're not living. Well, that's what Hezekiah knew about God and idols. He had destroyed all the idols in the land, but he knew that God could not be destroyed because he wasn't in the land. He was headquartered in heaven. He was alive. There was a living being on the other end of his prayers. Now, he prayed about a subject that we don't even like to think about, probably. He prayed about death. He had received a message that he was going to die, and he didn't want to die. So he said to God, in effect, change this. Now, I want to think about 4 things about death with us. We'll talk a little bit more about this. We're going to look at this same chapter in the worship hour, but the different point, different subject. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but let's lay the foundation about what the Bible says about death. Number 1, we all have an appointment with death. Hebrews 9:27 is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. You might break an appointment with a dentist, a hairstylist, a counselor, but you will not break an appointment with death. That day is coming, if the Lord delays his coming back, for all of us. You can also put in your notes there Hebrews 11:21, talking about Jacob as he was dying. He blessed his children and leaned upon his staff and worshiped God. You talk about a way to go out. Jacob may have set the bar as high as anybody ever did. He blessed others, he worshiped God, and he used his last strength, not for himself, but for others. Think about Genesis 3, when man becomes mortal, in the sense that he's denied access to the tree of life. And God says, from dust you're made, to dust you're going to return. Same idea is found in Ecclesiastes 12:7, speaking there in the first part, remember you're created in the days of your youth, before the evil days come. And then in verse 7, man's going to return to the dust from which he's made, but his soul is going to go to God. So we all have that appointment. That's the first thing to remember about death. And we cannot postpone it forever. Neither do we want to. Number 2, the Bible teaches about death that there are worse things than death for the Christian. Philippians 1:23, Paul said, I'm ready. I'm ready to die. It would be better. Now you think about Paul's circumstances. In Philippians, he's in prison. He's been beaten. He's been stoned prior to this. I mean, he's had a rough life. A lot of people hate him. And a lot of people would love to see him suffer and see him dead. So Paul's situation was such that it made heaven pretty attractive to him. Now, I have talked to people, and you may have too, who were ready to die. They were in so much pain, they say, pray for me to die. I'm ready. I want to be rid of this. Or I remember talking to a man who lost his wife. He was old. Most of his friends had been gone a long time, and he felt lonely in the world. And he said, you know, preacher, I'm ready. This world doesn't hold much for me. I understand that. For a person who's ready and who has faith about what's on the other side, there are worse things than death for sure. When you think about why we are believing and doing what we're believing and doing, isn't it all about the resurrection? If there's no resurrection, Paul said we are of all men most miserable. 1 Corinthians 15:19. Eat, drink, and be merry, tomorrow we die. If there's nothing else, but there is more. And we're banking on the fact that we've got a better situation coming than we've ever had here. And the door to that situation is death. So I have to go through the door to get to the blessings. So there are worse things than death. Now, another thing about death is we want to die well. I'll say this caveat before I'll explore this thought with you. The caveat is that often a person does not have his or her mind. They're not rational at the end. So they should not be held accountable for what they are incapable of doing. So I'll say that caveat first. But if we have our minds to the end, then we should die with the glory of God on our minds. We should die as we've lived by faith, not by fear. We should show others that what we have always proclaimed is what we really believe. So as we cross over to the other side, it's with the attitude of Paul. I'm ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand, 2 Timothy 4:8. So we want to die well so that people will say there is something to Christianity. There is something to faith. We want to show our children who may be gathered around our bed as we change worlds, or our grandchildren, we want to show them this is what legacy I'm leaving to you. A legacy of faith. I want you to hold on to your faith so you can see me again on the other side. Now, number 4 on our 4 points about death is not something, let me rephrase that. Death requires preparation beforehand. Death requires preparation beforehand. Some people just live life happy-go-lucky, and then they get down to the end and they didn't put any thought into life beyond this world. Well, that's a fool. Don't be a fool. A fool just lives for today. A wise man lives for an eternity. And this is the short part of our existence. It's a vapor that appears a little while and vanishes away like fog in the morning. James 4:14, it's a hand's breadth. Psalm 90, 1 through 3. It's like a shower that comes down hard in the summer and there's water on the ground, and then you look out a little while later and it's all dried up. That's what Moses said life is like. It's short. And so don't put all your eggs in the basket that you're soon going to fall out of your dead hand. In other words, don't live for this world, but put it in the bank that in the land that you're going to. So make preparations. Now we'll talk more about that next hour. So let's move into our second point. Hezekiah prayed to the compassionate God passionately. Let's think about God's compassion for a minute. That word means to feel with, to share in common. God does care. In fact, nobody's ever cared as much about you as God. Your own mother did not love you or does not love you like God does. Your spouse who would die for you does not love you as much as God does. Lamentations 3:23 says that His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. We sometimes sing that song, new every morning. You get up, and just as the sun rises in the morning, God's compassion rises with it. You've never lived a day of your life out from under the canopy of the love of God. Now, there are two things about God's love that make it personal. You could bank on your stake in John 3:16. We all have a stake in John 3:16. For God so loved the world. Well, I got a stake in that world. You do too, because we're a part of it. But we are a very small part of the 100 billion people or so that have ever lived. But Galatians 2:20 says, Paul speaking, who loved me and gave himself for me. How many people is me? Just one. Wendell Winkler preached here. He was my mentor, died in 2005, I think. But I heard him say this pretty often. He would say this in gospel meetings, but in class sometimes. He would say, I believe so strongly in the love of God that if I had been the only person God ever made and I sinned, God would have sent Jesus to die for me. Just for me. That's what Galatians 2:20 says. He gave himself for me. Now, when you think about it like that, we don't get lost in the aggregate of 100 billion. We see the love for the person that stares back at us from the mirror in the morning. Now, God's love is individual. That's the first thing. The second thing is, God is aware of our situations. You know, I just drove in, be here today, be somewhere else next Sunday. You know, I'm not really plugged in to what's going on in your life very much. Some of you more than others. You and me, the same thing. We're just busy. And we only have limited interaction time here. And I suppose that it is the case even with others that are here every time practically with you, that there are some things going on in lives in this assembly this morning that nobody else knows about. I mean, you brought a burden through those doors, and a burden sat down with you where you're seated presently that nobody else in the room knows about. Except one. Because God's in the room with us, and He knows. He knows what weighs down on your heart, what makes you cry into your pillow at night. He understands why you walk with a slow step. He understands why your energy level seems to be depleted, why you love to take naps more than interact with people. God knows those things. And He cares. 1 Peter 5:7 is a familiar text for many of us. It says, but casting your care upon Him, for, it's what's called a hinge word. It connects what came before with what comes after. And that's a hinge word of conclusion or purpose. For He careth for you. The verb there, it's a rancher's term. It's a horseman's term. The verb casting is a word for putting a saddle blanket or a saddle on a horse. That's a very vivid motion. We don't use that motion much, but it means to pick up and to toss away from, up and away from, which is pretty appropriate for our burdens. God says, here, let me hold that. Cast it up to me and away from you, casting your care on him. Now Hezekiah had a concern. He was going to die. He's praying to a compassionate God passionately. He's weeping as he prays. You know, the enemy of effective prayer life is temperature, low temperature. Somebody said heaven has no market for ice. The effectual, what kind of prayer avails much? What does fervent mean? To boil over. To be hot. I'll make this confession, or transparency maybe, but I dare say I'm not the only one in this room that would say this. Sometimes I've been praying along like my last prayer of the day in bed before I drift off to sleep. And I'll stop and think, what did I just pray? So I'm going through things that I say in prayer every day, every night. And the danger is I say them without thinking them, without meaning them. But if my prayer doesn't mean anything to me, it doesn't mean anything to God. If I have nothing vested in my prayer, God's not going to invest anything in my prayer. If I don't mean it, then it's not meaningful. So I have to learn to pray with passion. Now, I think it's interesting here that it says, now remember, he's on his sick bed, his deathbed. He turns his face to the wall. That's used later in chapter 21:4 of sullenness, or we might say pouting. But that's not what it means here. It's the same verb and it's the same action, but it's for a different purpose. He turned his face to the wall so he could pray to God privately without distractions. He's a king. You know, there are people coming and going, and he shuts them out as best he can by turning to face the blank wall. Now, he's too sick to get up and go to his closet, I guess, or his prayer place, but he does the best he can under the circumstances. He just looks at the wall. Now, that reminds us, of course, of Matthew 6, 5 through 8, where Jesus said, be not like the heathen, like the Pharisees. The Pharisees pray to be seen, the heathen pray to be heard. Don't be like that. He said, but when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut the door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and he will reward thee openly. So, pray to the compassionate God thoughtfully and passionately. Thoughtfully, no distraction. What the closet does two things. One, it isolates you from other people's knowledge. They don't know what you're doing right now, and that's the point. Don't, like with giving, don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. You don't want to do your religious actions for glory. So don't let people know if you can help it. That's the first purpose. Second purpose is to limit distractions. So you pray where there's a lot going on, then there's going to be noise, or maybe something that catches your eye, there may be, there's things around you. But if you go in your closet, there's no distraction. So a closet can be a closet, like we think of a closet, or any private place. You think about the passion the tears represent. It reminds me of Jesus when he was praying in the garden. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, nor John say he cried when he prayed. But he did cry. Because Hebrews 5:7 says, with strong crying and tears. Hebrews tells us what the gospel accounts don't, that he wept. Those 3 times he went back and forth, his face was wet with tears. I was thinking about this last night. Sometimes you have trouble going to sleep. What do? I think about sermons. That puts me to sleep. So I was thinking about this sermon. I was thinking, if my child comes to me, your child comes to you with a request, and they're crying, that impacts me, doesn't it you? I'm God's child. I come to him crying. That impacts him. He's compassionate. He cares. He hates to see us hurt. And I want to say, well, how can I fix this to my child? And he's my father saying, I can fix this if he chooses to. Sometimes we have to let our children experience some hard bumps in life in order to learn the lessons that make them grow up. God does that for us too. Number 3. Hezekiah prayed to the omnipotent God about his needs. When you get down on your knees or whatever posture you pray in, and you say, my Father, the God who rules the world, turns to face you and tilts his ear to hear what you're about to say. Somebody said there are 3 ways to accomplish something in the world. One is to think. That taps into intellectual power. The second is to work. That taps into physical power. And the third is to pray. That taps into God's power. What's the best way to get something done? To think, to work, or to pray? Well, there's more power in prayer than the other 2 put together. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do those things. God expects us to do what we can do, but there's power in prayer. There's power for whatever my need is. And I made a list, and I think I can remember this. But you can get it off the iPad later if you just want to take a picture of it. I made a list of people and what they prayed for in the Bible. And it's not as exhaustive. You could add a lot to it. But let me just go over some, and I think you'll know these, probably most or maybe all of these as we go through them. Hezekiah here prayed for life to be extended. 2 Kings 20 verse 1, and it was. Daniel prayed for help with his responsibilities and deliverance. Daniel 1 and 6. 6:10 would be his prayer. Isaac prayed for a wife. And he was given one. Hannah prayed for a son. And she had Samuel. David prayed for mercy. Psalm 51. These are in backward order as far as chronology is concerned. He prayed for mercy in Psalm 51. But Psalm 32 celebrates the forgiveness that he received. Bartimaeus prayed for light. Mark 10. And got it. And Paul prayed for the thorn to be removed. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. He didn't get that. He got grace, which was better than that. I guess this is a good place to put this in. Have you ever thought about the answers God gives to prayers? I don't mean specific prayers. I mean yes, no, like that. So here are the answers that God gives to prayer. You might think of another, but I think we have 5. Number 1 is, and his favorite answer is yes, to give us what it is that we want. Matthew 21:22. Whatsoever you ask in my name, believing, you'll receive. James 4:2 and 3. 1 John 3:22. Number 2 is no. He told Jesus no. He told Jesus no so he could say yes to us. If he had said yes to Jesus, he had to say no to us. I'm glad that he said no to Jesus, even though it's sad to think that Jesus had to go to the Calvary. But if he didn't go to Calvary, we wouldn't be here. We surely wouldn't be in heaven. So God, and that happens sometimes with lesser things too. Let's just say this time of year, there's a farmer who really needs rain. He said, I put all this money in the seed and the gas and the time, and it's just drying up. Please give me rain. I need rain. That's a Christian farmer praying that. But let's say there's somebody on the other side of town, maybe on the other side of the congregation or the pews, who has a wedding Saturday, and it's an outdoor wedding. And they're saying, God, we've put so much money into this. Please don't let it rain. Which prayer is God going to answer? You see, there are times like that. And there are times when I don't pray for what I ought to because I don't know or because I'm selfish. So sometimes God says no. When your children ask you for something, do you always say yes? No, we may say no more than we say yes, depending on the personality and the age of the child. Number 3 is not right now. Depending on your marital status right now, if you're a young person, single, but you reach that age where you're looking, you may be praying, God, give me a mate. And God might wait for a year before giving you that. Could you think of any circumstance when that would be better a year later than now? Yeah, maybe I'm not ready yet. Maybe I need to grow spiritually more. Maybe I need to be more mature so I can handle those responsibilities. Maybe I need to finish my education. There might be a lot of reasons, but God might say, wait. Nehemiah 1 and 2 is an example of that, where Nehemiah prayed in one month and it wasn't answered until a different month. God said, wait. Number 4 is something different. That's 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9, where he got grace when he prayed for the thorn to be removed. And he said, I'll most gladly glory in my infirmity. He said, this is better. And then number 5, something more. That's what he does here for Hezekiah. Hezekiah just asked to live. He says, I tell you what, I'll let you live 15 more years. That's a lot. You also see that in the prayer, the answer to Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 3, because he asked for wisdom. God said, I like that so much, I'm going to make you rich, and I'm going to give you a long reign as a king too, if you'll be faithful. Gave him more than he asked for. And how many times as we look back over our lives and we think, God has been so good to me. He's given me so much more than I ever deserved or even asked for. Those are the answers to prayer. And on this one, I heard the bell. I think we may have 3 minutes. But I'll tell you what, I will cover the 4th point in the 1 o'clock or 1:30 session today, just as a part. We're going to look through expositorily look through the text at 1, and we'll cover that point. But before I leave this one, I want to touch on God answered his prayer through means. Why bring figs into it? I don't know, but it seems to me. Now there's an argument, no, maybe not an argument, but a different view among the commentators on this. Most of them say this is a miracle, and I've always thought that too. But after preparing and thinking about this for the last few days, it seems to me like this may be a better example of providence and medicine than miracle. Now you could take whichever view you want, and you may be right either way. But it seems to me like if it had been a miracle, most of the miracles in the Scriptures are immediate, right? Not 3 days later. And don't involve medicine. Now, those who are on the miracle side say, well, it's like the clay that was put on the blind man's eyes. That could be the case. But I do know that our prayers are answered in combination between providence and medicine. I mean, just because you pray, that means you shouldn't go to the doctor, right? You shouldn't go to the hospital. No, that's not what that means. The great physician uses physicians to do his healing sometimes. So I think that just put in on this point about God's omnipotence sometimes is not applied directly, but through means or instrumentality. All right, our time's up. We'll come back at the next hour and go back into the same text.